On May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill stood before the British Parliament and promised nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. In that moment, he became the voice that held Western civilization together against Adolf Hitler. But Churchill did not build himself. The political instincts, the social networks, the rhetorical fire, the sheer nerve to believe he was destined for greatness, all of it was manufactured by a woman who never lived to see his finest hour. She was born Jennie Jerome in Brooklyn, New York. She could not vote, she could not hold office, and she constructed the most consequential political career of the 20th century from a dinner table. This is her story, not his. Chapter 1. The speculator's daughter learns the only game that matters. Leonard Jerome kept his mistress in the house next door to his wife, and his second daughter watched everything. The house stood at 26 East 26th Street, on the corner of Madison Square in Manhattan. It was 6 stories of brownstone ambition, with a private theater that seated 600, a ballroom lined with fountains, and stables for some of the finest racehorses in America. Leonard Jerome had built it to announce himself to New York. He was a Wall Street speculator, a man who had turned nerve and timing into a fortune estimated at $10 million, roughly $300 million in today's money. He co-founded the American Jockey Club and transformed horse racing from a disreputable pastime into a fashionable sport. He owned a significant stake in the New York Times. He raced his horses on a private track in the Bronx that bore his name. And he installed his lover, the opera singer Fanny Ronalds, in a house immediately adjacent to the family residence on Madison Square. His wife Clara saw everything. His daughter Jeanette, whom everyone called Jennie, saw more. The Jerome household was a laboratory in the mechanics of power, charm, and deception. Leonard Jerome was not a subtle man. He was loud. He was generous. He was reckless with money and women in roughly equal measure. He threw parties where the guests included Ulysses S. Grant, the editors of every major New York newspaper, and the singers from the Academy of Music, whom he courted with a shamelessness that scandalized even Gilded Age New York. He understood, with the instincts of a natural operator, that access to powerful men was itself a form of currency. You could buy nothing with respectability alone, but a good dinner party, a fine racehorse, and a well-told story could buy you almost anything. Jennie absorbed this. She was born on January the 9th, 1854, in the Cobble Hill neighborhood of Brooklyn, the second of Leonard and Clara's 3 daughters. She was dark-haired, dark-eyed, and possessed of a physical magnetism that observers would later struggle to describe without reaching for animal metaphors. But she was not simply beautiful. She was watchful. She learned from a childhood spent observing her father's transactions and betrayals that the real exchanges happened not in banks or offices, but in drawing rooms. That charm was a weapon. That money came and went, but the ability to command a room lasted. The money did go. Leonard Jerome's fortune was volatile by design. He speculated in railroads, in commodities, in anything that moved fast and promised large. The panics of the 1860s and 70s could erase millions in an afternoon. He lost fortunes. He rebuilt them. He lost them again. By the early 1870s, the family's finances were uncertain enough that Clara Jerome made a decision that would alter the course of British history. She was humiliated. Her husband's infidelities were public knowledge. New York society whispered about Leonard and Fanny Ronalds with the kind of relish that made Clara's social position untenable. And Clara, who came from a respectable Huguenot family and had married Leonard expecting stability, decided she had endured enough. She took her daughters to Paris. This was not a vacation. It was a strategic withdrawal. In the Paris of the Second Empire and the early Third Republic, American money bought social access that New York's old families would never have granted. Clara enrolled Jennie at the Conservatoire de Paris, where she studied piano with enough seriousness that some teachers believed she could have pursued a professional career. She learned French until she spoke it like a native. She absorbed the codes of European aristocratic society, the invisible rules about how to enter a room, how to seat a dinner table, how to signal interest and withhold it. She was being polished. But the polish had a purpose. Clara Jerome's humiliation had become Clara Jerome's ambition. If her husband could not give her respectability, her daughters would acquire it through marriage. Not American marriage, European marriage, titled marriage, the kind that turned money into rank and rank into permanence. The Jerome family's annual expenditure in Paris was estimated at several £1,000s, an investment Clara was willing to make because the return she expected was measured not in interest rates but in coronets. The plan was simple. The execution would require everything the Jerome women had. Jennie was 19 years old. She was fluent in French and competent in Italian. She played piano with genuine artistry. She was the daughter of a man whose fortune was already shrinking, but whose name still carried the scent of money. And she had spent her entire life watching her father convert charm into leverage, watching her mother endure what could not be changed and weaponize what could. She was ready. She just needed the right man. The right man appeared at a yachting regatta on the Isle of Wight, and he appeared within 72 hours. Chapter 2. 3 days to reshape the British Empire. On August the 12th, 1873, a 20-year-old American girl met a younger son of a duke, and within 72 hours, the future of Britain was decided. The setting was Cowes Week, the annual regatta on the Isle of Wight, where British high society gathered to race yachts, gossip, and arrange its future. The Prince of Wales was present, the Russian Tsar's family attended, and aboard HMS Ariadne, at a ball hosted to honor the visiting Tsarevich, Jennie Jerome met Lord Randolph Churchill. Randolph was 24. He was the second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, which meant he had the name, but not the inheritance. Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest houses in England, a Baroque monument to the 1st Duke of Marlborough's military victories, belonged to his elder brother. Randolph had a seat in the House of Commons, representing the family pocket borough of Woodstock. He had a modest income. He had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and he had a reputation for impulsiveness that would define his entire career. He was also, by most accounts, immediately and completely overwhelmed by Jennie Jerome. The courtship was absurdly fast. They met on a Tuesday evening. By Thursday evening, Randolph had proposed. Jennie had accepted. 3 days. The speed has fascinated historians for a century and a half. Was this love at first sight? Infatuation? Or was it recognition? Two ambitious people spotting in each other exactly what they needed. What happened next reveals far more about the world these two people inhabited than the romance ever could. The proposal triggered a negotiation, not between Randolph and Jennie, but between Leonard Jerome in New York and the 7th Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim Palace. The subject was money. The tone was brutal. The correspondence between the two fathers reads less like wedding planning than a hostile corporate merger. The Duke did not want the match. He considered the Jeromes vulgar. Americans were suspect by nature. Self-made money was worse than no money at all. The Duchess of Marlborough was openly hostile, referring to Jennie with a coldness that never thawed. Queen Victoria, when informed of the proposed match, expressed displeasure. A son of Marlborough marrying the daughter of a stock speculator was, in the social calculus of Victorian England, an act very close to disgrace. But the Churchills needed money. Blenheim Palace cost roughly £10,000 per year to maintain. The family's agricultural rents were declining as cheap American grain flooded English markets, and Leonard Jerome, for all his volatility, could produce cash. The negotiation dragged on for months, conducted by letter across the Atlantic. Leonard offered a dowry of £50,000, a substantial sum, roughly £5 million in today's currency. The Duke demanded that the money be settled in a way that kept it under Churchill family control. Jerome fought for his daughter to retain some financial independence. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 had begun to grant women certain rights over their own assets, but the law was new, unevenly applied, and widely ignored by aristocratic families who had their own ideas about who controlled the money. The final settlement placed the £50,000 in a trust that paid Jennie an income of roughly £2,000 per year. It was enough to live modestly. It was nowhere near enough to live the way the Churchills were expected to live, in a world of country houses, London seasons, horses, servants, and the ceaseless social performance that sustained political careers. The gap between what Jennie had and what she needed would define the next 40 years of her life. They married on April the 15th, 1874, at the British Embassy in Paris. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough did not attend. The wedding was small, the bride was 20. The groom was 25. The settlement was signed. The transaction was complete. And then the arithmetic began. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November the 30th, 1874, just 7.5 months after the April wedding. The official story was that he arrived prematurely, 2 months early, after Jennie took a fall during a shooting party at Blenheim. The unofficial story, whispered through London society for decades and never fully silenced, was considerably simpler. The date was noted. The eyebrows were raised. The scandal attached itself to the Churchill family like a burr and stayed there for the rest of the century. What mattered more than the scandal was the reality. Jennie Jerome was now Lady Randolph Churchill. She had traded her father's money for a title, her beauty for access, and her American identity for a seat at the table of the most powerful empire on earth. The question was what she would do once she sat down. Chapter 3. The American who decoded the British operating system. Within 5 years of arriving in London as a despised outsider, Jennie Jerome had infiltrated the inner circle of the future King of England. The speed of this achievement is almost impossible to appreciate without understanding the system she had to crack. Victorian aristocratic society was not merely exclusive, it was coded. The rules were unwritten, and the penalties for breaking them were ruthless and permanent. Which houses you visited determined which houses would visit you. Which invitations you accepted and which you declined signaled your rank as precisely as a military uniform. Where you sat at dinner reflected in exact order the hierarchy of the room. How you addressed a duke's younger son versus an earl's eldest daughter. When you spoke, how long you spoke, and to whom you spoke. These were not trivialities. They were the operating language of power. Get them wrong and doors close forever. Get them right, and doors opened into rooms where the future of the empire was negotiated over port and cigars. Jennie got them right. She studied British society the way a diplomat studies a foreign government. She identified the power centers. She mapped the networks. She cataloged the alliances and the enmities, and she offered something that no English woman of her generation could match. She was different, not just American different, fundamentally, disruptively different. She had what Lord de Bernon later described as a quality more of a panther than a woman, a physical presence that combined dark beauty with a directness that English aristocrats found simultaneously alarming and irresistible. She played the piano with genuine skill, well enough to perform at private concerts alongside professional musicians. She spoke French fluently, at a time when French was the language of diplomacy and fashion. She had been educated in Paris, not in the stifling schoolrooms of the English country house. She was worldly in a way that the daughters of English dukes simply were not. And she was fearless. She entered conversations with a confidence that startled men accustomed to deference. She had opinions and she expressed them. She was witty without being cruel, charming without being submissive. In a society that expected women to be decorative and silent, Jennie was decorative and unforgettable. The key to Jennie's social conquest was the Prince of Wales. The future King Edward VII was the center of a social universe known as the Marlborough House set, named after his London residence. This was not a political party, it was a culture. The Marlborough House set valued wit, beauty, sophistication, and discretion. It tolerated adultery as long as the participants observed certain unbreakable rules. Never embarrass the host, never create a public scandal, never force a husband to notice what everyone already knew. It rewarded women who could hold a dinner table in thrall, and it was presided over by a man who adored beautiful, intelligent women, and who found in Jennie Jerome a companion who was both. The precise nature of Jennie's relationship with the Prince of Wales has been debated by historians for over a century. Contemporary gossip was unambiguous. The prince visited Jennie frequently. He favored her company. He seated her near him at dinner. Whether the relationship was sexual or merely intensely social is a question that the surviving evidence cannot definitively answer. What is not debated is the result. The prince's favor made Jennie socially untouchable. No hostess could exclude a woman the future king chose to include. No aristocratic rival could diminish a woman whose dinner invitations the heir to the throne accepted. In a society where social position was political currency, Jennie had acquired the backing of the most powerful social force in England. She used it immediately and precisely. Her dinners became legendary, not for the food, which was excellent, or the wine, which was expensive, but for the guest lists. She mixed politicians with generals, diplomats with newspaper editors, financiers with cabinet ministers. She did not merely host, she curated. She understood, because her father had taught her, that the most valuable thing in any room was not food or wine or music. It was the conversation between two men who had not previously spoken, engineered by a hostess who knew exactly what each man needed from the other, and who positioned them accordingly. By 1880, Jennie Jerome Churchill had transformed herself. She had arrived in London as a suspect American bride, tolerated by a family that considered her beneath them, unknown to a society that did not trust outsiders. Within 6 years, she was one of the most sought-after women in England. She was inside the machine. She understood how it worked, every lever, every gear, every hidden connection, and she was about to begin operating it on behalf of her husband, with a precision that would make his career and very nearly make her own. Chapter 4. The wife who ran the campaign he thought was his. Lord Randolph Churchill believed he was the most brilliant political mind in the Conservative Party, and his wife let him believe it. He was not wrong about his brilliance. He was wrong about its source. Randolph Churchill had genuine political talent. He was a devastating debater in the House of Commons, quick with language, savage with opponents, possessed of a rhetorical flair that could electrify a chamber and terrify a target. He could dismantle an argument in 3 sentences. He could make a government minister squirm with a single question. In the early 1880s, he co-founded what became known as the Fourth Party, a faction of 4 conservative backbenchers who attacked their own party leadership with a ferocity usually reserved for the opposition. The Fourth Party was outnumbered. It did not matter. Randolph's speeches made news. His provocations made enemies. His audacity made him impossible to ignore. He developed a political philosophy he called Tory democracy, a populist blend of conservative imperialism and working-class appeal that anticipated much of 20th century British politics. He argued that the Conservative Party should not be a club for landlords and parsons, but a movement that spoke to ordinary English workers. The idea was decades ahead of its time. The politician promoting it was decades too impatient to execute it properly. By 1886, at the age of 37, Lord Randolph Churchill had risen to Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. He was the second most powerful man in the British government. He was being discussed as a future Prime Minister. The speed of his ascent had created the impression, carefully maintained, that he was a self-made political force, a natural genius whose brilliance had carried him to the summit. He was not self-made. Jennie was the engine. Start with the campaigns. In an era when political wives were expected to smile, appear at church, and otherwise remain invisible, Jennie canvassed voters door to door. During Randolph's campaigns, most notably his 1885 contest in the working-class constituency of Paddington South, she visited homes and streets that aristocratic women never entered. She climbed narrow staircases in tenement buildings. She knocked on doors and spoke directly to voters with an energy and ease that left experienced party operatives astonished. She wore a dress in Randolph's racing colors, pink and chocolate brown, a branding decision that made her instantly recognizable. She smiled. She remembered names. She shook hands with a warmth that transcended class barriers. She was, in a country that would not allow her to vote for another 33 years, running a modern political campaign with instincts that political professionals would not articulate for another century. But the canvassing was the visible part. The invisible part was more consequential. Jennie ran the social machinery that made Randolph's faction possible. The dinners she hosted were not entertainment. They were strategy sessions with tablecloths and silver candlesticks. At her table, the members of the Fourth Party met sympathetic journalists who would carry their message to the public. Wavering backbenchers were seated next to allies who could bring them on side. Potential donors were placed beside politicians who could explain why their money would be well spent. The wives of rival politicians were cultivated by Jennie personally because she understood what many political men did not, that a wife who disliked you would ensure her husband opposed you, and a wife who admired you could bring her husband to your side without him ever knowing he had been moved. She managed Randolph's press relationships with the sophistication of a modern campaign director. She knew which editors were sympathetic. She knew which reporters could be trusted with a story and which would distort it. She knew which newspapers would carry a speech favorably and which would bury it. She ensured that Randolph's most effective lines were reported accurately and that his rivals' weaknesses were known to the right journalists at the right time. She was, in everything but name, his press secretary, his campaign manager, and his chief strategist. The result was a political operation that looked, from the outside, like the work of a single brilliant man. It was not. It was the work of a partnership in which one partner received all the credit and the other received none. This was not unusual for the era. It was the design of the era. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. Her property became his. Her earnings belonged to him. Her political work existed only as an extension of his career. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 had begun to erode coverture, but the social reality lagged decades behind the legal reform. Jennie could own property in her own name. She could not own her own achievements. The scale of what she managed was extraordinary. Consider the numbers. The Churchill household income was roughly £3,000 to £4,000 per year, drawn primarily from Jennie's marriage settlement and Randolph's small share of the family trusts. Their annual expenditure consistently exceeded £6,000. The gap, £2,000 to £3,000 every year, was filled by borrowing, by selling assets when they had assets to sell, and by the relentless illusion of prosperity that Jennie maintained through sheer force of will. She spent money she did not have to host dinners she could not afford for people whose support Randolph needed but could not secure on his own. The financial architecture of the Fourth Party's rise was built on Jennie's debts, and then Randolph destroyed it in a single evening. In December of 1886, Lord Randolph Churchill resigned as Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was a gamble. He believed that Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, could not govern without him. He expected Salisbury to capitulate, to negotiate, to beg him to return, to give him whatever concessions he demanded on the budget. He wrote the letter of resignation without consulting Jennie. He sent it on a Monday evening. By Tuesday morning, Salisbury had accepted it. The acceptance was immediate, contemptuous, and final. Salisbury did not negotiate. He did not delay. He did not beg. He simply replaced Randolph with George Goschen, a liberal unionist, and moved on with the business of government. And Randolph Churchill, who 24 hours earlier had been the second most powerful man in Britain, was politically finished at 37. Jennie tried to save it. She mobilized every ally she could reach. She worked the networks she had spent years building, calling on sympathetic politicians, pressing the wives she had cultivated, reaching out to editors she had managed for half a decade. She visited and wrote and argued and pleaded, but the damage was absolute. A resignation offered and accepted cannot be unresigned. The allies she contacted sympathized. They did not act. The press, which had been managed so carefully for years, turned with the speed that only the press can manage. Yesterday's rising star became today's cautionary tale. Lord Randolph Churchill's political career was effectively over at 37. He would spend the remaining 8 years of his life in a long, terrible decline, watching other men occupy the positions he had abandoned. His wife would spend those 8 years dealing with consequences far worse than a lost chancellorship. Because while Randolph was destroying his career, something else was destroying his mind. Chapter 5. 200 Lovers and a Dying Husband. While Lord Randolph Churchill's mind was disintegrating behind closed doors, his wife was building the most powerful private network in the British Empire. The nature of Randolph's illness has been debated for over a century. The diagnosis given at the time was general paralysis of the insane, a Victorian medical term for the tertiary stage of syphilis. Some modern medical historians have questioned this diagnosis, suggesting alternative explanations including a brain tumor, multiple sclerosis, or other neurological disease. What is not debated is the trajectory. From the late 1880s onward, Randolph's behavior became increasingly erratic. His speech grew slurred. His handwriting deteriorated into illegibility. His judgment, once sharp enough to terrorize cabinet ministers, became unreliable and bizarre. His outbursts in the House of Commons, once celebrated for their controlled fury, became embarrassing and disturbing. By 1893, he could barely speak coherently in public. Members who had once feared his interventions now looked away when he rose to speak. Jennie managed this catastrophe with a discipline that deserves the word strategic. She maintained the public fiction of a devoted wife, supporting a husband who was merely overworked or unwell. She controlled access to Randolph, ensuring that visitors saw him only at his best moments. She accompanied him on a disastrous world tour in 1894, watching him deteriorate in hotel rooms across Japan, Burma, and Singapore, while projecting serenity and composure to anyone who observed them. She was, by this point, nursing a man whose mind was gone, while simultaneously rebuilding the power base that his catastrophic resignation had destroyed. She rebuilt it through relationships, specifically through the relationships that gave her story its most scandalous and most misunderstood dimension. The number that history has attached to Jennie Jerome Churchill is 200. 200 lovers. The figure comes from various sources of varying reliability, and it is almost certainly an exaggeration. Some biographers have attributed the claim to King Edward VII himself, though the attribution is not definitively sourced. But the truth beneath the exaggeration is more interesting than the number itself. Jennie's romantic relationships were not merely romantic. Each one connected her to a different node of power. Each was a channel of intelligence. Each gave her access to information and influence that no woman of her era could have obtained through formal means, because no formal means existed. Count Charles Kinsky was the most significant. He was an Austro-Hungarian diplomat stationed in London, dashing, athletic, and passionately devoted to Jennie for nearly a decade. He had won the Grand National Steeplechase in 1883, riding his own horse Do Nothing at odds of 20-1, a victory that gave him a celebrity crossing every social boundary in England. His affair with Jennie was the worst-kept secret in London society. Through Kinsky, Jennie had access to diplomatic intelligence from the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Service, to the social networks of continental European courts, and to a channel of information about the shifting alliances that would ultimately produce the First World War. He was, in the language of intelligence, a source of extraordinary value. The Prince of Wales provided royal access that no amount of money could purchase. His patronage shielded Jennie from social attack, and guaranteed her a place at the center of English political society. Herbert Henry Asquith, who would serve as Prime Minister from 1908 to 1916, represented the Liberal Party establishment and gave Jennie a window into the opposition's thinking. Lord Kitchener, the military commander whose campaigns in Sudan and South Africa shaped the empire, connected her to the upper reaches of the British Army. The American Congressman Bork Cochran, a celebrated orator of the Democratic Party, maintained Jennie's connections to American political power, and later became a rhetorical mentor to young Winston, teaching him the speaking techniques, the rhythms and cadences of American oratory that would make him the greatest public speaker of the 20th century. This was not promiscuity. This was architecture. Each relationship gave Jennie access to a different corridor of power. Through her lovers and admirers, she assembled an intelligence network that would have been the envy of any diplomatic service. She knew what was happening in Parliament before the debates were public. She knew what the Foreign Office was planning before the memoranda were circulated. She knew which generals favored which campaigns, which ambassadors supported which alliances. She knew it because the men who ran these institutions told her, in the intimate hours when powerful men become talkative and indiscreet. She was, without holding any formal position, one of the best informed people in the British Empire. The human cost of this architecture should not be overlooked. Jennie's second son, John Strange Spencer Churchill, known as Jack, was born on February 4th, 1880. The timing has fueled speculation about his paternity for over a century. Randolph and Jennie's marriage was, by all accounts, sexually distant by the late 1870s. Several of Jennie's biographers have noted that Jack bore little physical resemblance to Randolph or to Winston, though such observations are circumstantial at best. The question of who fathered Jack has never been definitively answered. What can be said is that Jennie raised both sons in the peculiar manner of the Victorian aristocracy, largely through servants and boarding schools, at a distance that Winston, in particular, would never stop feeling. His letters from school are agonizing in their repetition. "My darling mummy," he wrote again and again from Harrow and from his preparatory school, begging her to visit, begging her to come to school events, begging her to write. "Please do come down," he pleaded at age 9. "It would be so nice." The letters went largely unanswered, or answered briefly and late. Winston later described his mother as the evening star, someone he loved at a distance, a celestial object that illuminated his sky but remained always too far away to touch. He adored her. He was desperate for her attention, and he received it only intermittently in flashes of warmth followed by long silences that he filled with fantasies about what a closer relationship might feel like. This was not cruelty by the standards of her class. It was the norm. But the norm produced a wound that never fully healed. Winston Churchill's lifelong need for approval, his hunger for public admiration, his desperate energy, his conviction that he must prove himself worthy of attention. These were not merely temperamental traits. They were the products of a childhood spent reaching for a mother who was always somewhere else, doing something more important, building something larger than maternal devotion. By 1894, Randolph's condition had become impossible to conceal. The world tour that Jennie organized was a last attempt to create a dignified fiction, a sick man traveling for his health. It fooled no one. Randolph Churchill returned to England in a state of near total collapse and died on January the 24th, 1895, in his London home. He was 45 years old. Jennie was 41. She was a widow. She was in debt. Her social position was precarious, and within months, she would lose the man she loved most. The question was whether she would survive the loss. She did more than survive. She redirected every ounce of energy she possessed toward a single, audacious project. Chapter 6. The son she chose over the lover she wanted. In 1895, within months of burying her husband, Jennie Jerome lost the only man she ever truly loved and redirected everything toward the son she had neglected for 20 years. Count Charles Kinsky had been Jennie's great love. Not Randolph, whose marriage to her had evolved from genuine attraction into a business arrangement sustained by duty and social convention. Kinsky was passion. He was the man who made her pulse quicken, the man whose letters she kept, the man she wanted beside her. For nearly a decade, their affair had been conducted in the drawing rooms and country houses of England, tolerated by a society that expected its aristocrats to manage their hearts discreetly. And in 1895, under intense pressure from his aristocratic Austro-Hungarian family, who would not accept a twice-widowed, financially precarious American as the wife of a Kinsky, Charles married another woman, Countess Elizabeth Wolff Metternich zur Gracht. Jennie was devastated. The loss of Kinsky, coming so soon after Randolph's death, was the great emotional catastrophe of her life. She had buried a husband she did not love and lost a lover she did. She was 41 years old, financially precarious, socially vulnerable, and for perhaps the first time in her adult life, entirely alone in the way that matters most. And then she made the decision that would define the 20th century. She would build Winston. The irony is exquisite and painful. For 20 years, Jennie had been an inconsistent mother at best. Winston's childhood letters, dozens of them preserved in archives and published by historians, document a son's unrelenting campaign for his mother's attention. A campaign that had all the persistence and none of the success of his later military ventures. "Please do come down to see me," he wrote at age 9. "I shall be so disappointed if you don't come." She rarely came. "I have only had one letter from you this term," he wrote from Harrow, his reproach barely concealed. She wrote infrequently and visited less. He told her about school plays she missed, cricket matches she did not attend, illnesses she did not visit, small triumphs and large anxieties she did not acknowledge. He was raised by his nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest, whom he loved with a devotion he never quite managed to extend to anyone else, and whose death in 1895 he mourned more visibly than he mourned his own father. But starting in 1895, Jennie Jerome Churchill became a different kind of mother. She became a campaign manager, an operator, a machine. The first project was Winston's military career. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst after 2 failed attempts at the entrance examination, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Hussars. His pay was £120 per year. His expenses, horses, uniforms, mess bills, polo ponies, the costs of living as an officer in a fashionable cavalry regiment were closer to £700 annually. Jennie paid the difference. She could not afford it. She paid it anyway, drawing on her trust income, borrowing when necessary, living on the illusion of solvency. But money was the least of what she provided. Winston wanted to see action. He wanted battlefield experience that would generate the kind of celebrity that could launch a political career. He had seen how his father's fame had opened doors, and he intended to be more famous still. Jennie understood this instinct because it was exactly the kind of calculated risk her father, Lord Jerome, would have taken. She went to work. She lobbied Sir Henry Drummond Wolfe, the British ambassador to Spain, to arrange Winston's observation of the Cuban War of Independence in 1895. Winston was 20 years old. He had no business being near a war zone. Jennie's connections placed him there. She pressured generals, called in favors, and leveraged every social relationship she possessed to secure him a posting with the Malaccan Field Force on India's northwest frontier in 1897. She browbeat newspaper editors into publishing his dispatches, turning a junior officer's letters home into published journalism that made his name known in London, drawing rooms, and editorial offices alike. And then came Omdurman. In 1898, General Herbert Kitchener was preparing to lead a British and Egyptian force up the Nile to confront the Mahdist army at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan. Winston desperately wanted to join the 21st Lancers for the campaign. He saw it for exactly what it was, an opportunity for the kind of battlefield glory that made political careers. Kitchener refused, flatly, repeatedly. He did not like ambitious young officers who used military postings as material for newspaper articles and books. He had specifically and personally denied Winston Churchill a place in the expeditionary force. Jennie overrode him. She deployed every relationship she had. She contacted the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, directly. She worked through Lady June, a prominent hostess with political connections, and through Sir Evelyn Wood, the Adjutant General. She pressured, cajoled, and maneuvered through channels both official and personal until the Commander-in-Chief's refusal was reversed. Winston was attached to the 21st Lancers and sent to Sudan. He rode in one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history. At the Battle of Omdurman on September 2, 1898, he survived. He wrote about it brilliantly, and the book that resulted, The River War, published in 1899 in 2 volumes, made Winston Churchill a public figure whose name was known well beyond the military circles where he had served. This was not a proud mother helping her son get a good posting. This was a political operative executing a career launch strategy with the precision of a military campaign. Jennie identified the opportunities. She calculated the risks. She deployed her network of relationships to override institutional resistance from the highest levels of the British Army. She did it without formal authority, without official position, without the ability to give orders to anyone. She did it with dinner invitations, personal appeals, and the accumulated social capital of 20 years of strategic relationship building. The scale of her investment was ruinous. Between 1895 and 1900, Jennie spent thousands of pounds she did not have on Winston's military career, his writing ventures, his election campaigns, and the social machinery required to make a young man with a famous name but no fortune into a viable political candidate. She borrowed against her trust income. She sold jewelry. She lived on credit that was extended to her because she was Lady Randolph Churchill, and Lady Randolph Churchill was assumed to be wealthy. She was not wealthy. She was determined, and the determination was about to produce its most dramatic result. Because in December of 1899, while Winston was in South Africa making himself famous, his mother was about to make herself unforgettable. Chapter 7. The Ship She Sailed to War. In December of 1899, a 45-year-old society hostess chartered a hospital ship, recruited its entire medical staff, and sailed into a war zone. The Boer War had broken out in October of 1899. British forces in South Africa were struggling. The opening months of the conflict had produced a series of embarrassing defeats at the hands of Boer commandos, who knew the terrain and fought with a tenacity that the British military establishment had not anticipated. Casualties were mounting. Medical infrastructure was inadequate. The Army's medical corps was overwhelmed by the scale of injuries being produced by modern weapons. And Jennie Jerome Churchill, who had never run a military operation, who had never managed a medical facility, who had no institutional authority of any kind and no government brief, decided she would equip and command a hospital ship. She called it the Maine, after the American battleship whose destruction in Havana Harbor had helped trigger the Spanish-American War the year before. The name was deliberate. It signaled Jennie's identity as an American, even after 25 years in Britain. It was a statement. It was also a brand. The logistics were staggering. She needed a ship. She persuaded the Atlantic Transport Company, an American shipping line, to provide a vessel. She needed medical staff. She recruited surgeons, nurses, and orderlies. She needed equipment, surgical instruments, bandages, medicine, beds, blankets, food supplies for months at sea. She bought it all. She needed money. She raised it. 45,000 pounds. In today's currency, roughly 5 million pounds. Raised entirely through Jennie's personal network in a matter of weeks. She wrote letters to every wealthy contact she had accumulated over 2 decades of strategic social cultivation. She held fundraising events in London drawing rooms. She called in favors from American millionaires, British aristocrats, and friends across 2 continents. She persuaded, she charmed, she pressured. The money came because Jennie asked for it. Because when Jennie Jerome Churchill asked you for something, refusal required a courage that most people did not possess. Consider what this meant. A woman with no reliable personal fortune, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of annual income already pledged against her debts, with no government position, no military rank, and no institutional backing of any kind, conceived, funded, staffed, and launched a hospital ship in less than 3 months. The British government, whose War Office struggled throughout the Boer War to organize its own medical logistics, could not have moved faster. Most government officials could not have done it at all. The Maine sailed from London on December the 23rd, 1899, and arrived in Durban, South Africa, in February of 1900. Jennie was aboard. She was 45 years old. She slept in a cabin. She wore a nurse's uniform. She oversaw the treatment of hundreds of wounded soldiers, British and Boer alike. She operated in a war zone for several months, enduring heat, disease, and the proximity of combat. The ship's medical team treated cases that ranged from gunshot wounds to typhoid fever, the invisible enemy that killed more soldiers in the Boer War than Boer bullets did. The decision to treat soldiers from both sides of the conflict was characteristic. It reflected Jennie's lifelong refusal to operate within conventional boundaries, when those boundaries struck her as stupid. A wounded soldier was a wounded soldier. His nationality was irrelevant to his pain. The Red Cross agreed. The Victorian military establishment was less certain. Jennie did not ask for their certainty. The scale of the Maine's operation deserves its own reckoning. The ship carried a staff of doctors, nurses, and orderlies numbering in the dozens. It was equipped with surgical theaters capable of performing amputations and extracting bullets under wartime conditions. It sailed roughly 6,000 miles from the Thames to the coast of Natal. Jennie, who had never managed anything larger than a household staff and a literary quarterly, was now responsible for the daily operation of a floating hospital in a combat zone. She handled supply procurement. She dealt with military bureaucracy. She managed personnel disputes. She was 45 years old, an age at which most women of her class were settling into grandmotherhood. She was sleeping in a ship's cabin off the coast of Africa, watching surgeons operate on men who had been shot that morning. While Jennie was running her hospital ship, Winston was becoming the most famous young man in the British Empire. In October 1899, he had gone to South Africa as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, at a salary of £250 per month, the highest fee any newspaper had ever paid a war correspondent. In November, the armored train he was riding was ambushed by Boer forces near Chively and Natal. Winston was captured and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. On December the 12th, he escaped, clambering over a wall under cover of darkness and traveling nearly 300 miles through enemy territory to reach the safety of Portuguese East Africa. The escape made him a national hero. His photograph appeared in every newspaper in England. Mother and son were now operating simultaneously in the same theater of war, each generating a wave of public attention that reinforced the other. Jennie's hospital ship demonstrated Churchill family patriotism and public service. Winston's escape demonstrated Churchill family courage and daring. The two stories, running in parallel in the London press, created a family mythology that was greater than either story alone. This was not coordinated by telephone calls or strategy documents. But Jennie understood, with the instincts her father had given her, that fame was cumulative. Every mention of the Churchill name in connection with the Boer War strengthened the brand. Every newspaper article about the Maine reflected well on Winston. Every story about Winston's escape reflected well on Jennie's family. The two narratives fed each other, creating a momentum that Jennie had spent years learning to generate. By the time Jennie returned to England, Winston was preparing to stand for Parliament. He had name recognition that politicians twice his age could not match. He had a reputation for courage. He had a mother who had just demonstrated that the Churchill family's commitment to the empire was backed by action, not merely words and speeches. In October of 1900, Winston Churchill was elected to the House of Commons as the Member of Parliament for Oldham. He was 25 years old. He had no money of his own. He had no independent political base. He had no powerful patron in the traditional sense. He had Jennie, and Jennie had spent every resource she possessed to put him there. The investment was beginning to pay, but the investor was running out of capital, out of allies, and out of time. Chapter 8. The fortune she never had and spent anyway. Jennie Jerome Churchill's most audacious act of power was maintaining the illusion of wealth while drowning in debt for 40 years. The numbers tell a story that no biography can adequately capture. From the moment of her marriage in 1874 to the day of her death in 1921, Jennie Jerome Churchill lived beyond her means. Not occasionally, not accidentally, systematically and deliberately, as a calculated instrument of power. Her income from the marriage settlement was roughly £2,000 per year. After Randolph's death, additional income from various trusts and investments brought her annual total to perhaps £3,000 to £4,000. Her annual expenditure consistently exceeded £6,000. The deficit, amounting to £2,000 to £3,000 every year, was covered by borrowing against future income, by selling assets when she had them, by pawning jewelry and racing trophies, and by the financial equivalent of holding one's breath and hoping that nobody asked to see the accounts. This was not foolishness. This was strategy. In the world Jennie inhabited, the appearance of wealth was wealth. The distinction between having money and appearing to have money was, for practical purposes, non-existent. A woman who economized visibly was a woman who was finished. The hostess who served cheaper wine, who reduced the number of courses at dinner from 12 to 8, who wore last season's dresses or redecorated less frequently than her rivals, was a hostess whose guest list would contract. And a contracting guest list meant a contracting network. And a contracting network meant diminished power, diminished access, diminished ability to operate. For Jennie, spending money she did not have was not extravagance. It was the price of admission to the rooms where power operated. The most ambitious of her financial gambles was the Anglo-Saxon Review. Launched in 1899, it was a quarterly literary and political journal conceived by Jennie as a prestige publication that would establish her as a serious intellectual figure, not merely a hostess but an editor, a publisher, a woman of ideas. Each issue was bound in a different ornate cover, modeled on historical book bindings, and produced with a lavishness that made it one of the most beautiful periodicals of its era. The contributors included Henry James, Algernon Charles Swinburne, George Bernard Shaw, and other luminaries of the literary establishment. Jennie edited it personally. She solicited the articles. She managed the contributors. She oversaw the design. It lost money on every single issue of its 10-number run. The production costs were enormous. The subscription base was tiny. The advertisers were insufficient. The Anglo-Saxon Review was, by any commercial measure, a failure. But Jennie did not launch it to make money. She launched it to demonstrate capability. She wanted the world, and more importantly, the political world, to understand that she was not merely a hostess and a mother. She was an editor, a publisher, a woman who could conceive, finance, and execute a complex intellectual project. The Anglo-Saxon Review failed as a business. As a credential, as a demonstration of capacity, it succeeded. The cost of launching Winston's career was more concrete and more devastating. A cavalry officer's pay of £120 per year covered virtually nothing in a regiment where polo ponies alone could cost several £100s. The real expenses, horses, equipment, mess bills, travel, clothing, servants, were closer to £700 annually. Jennie paid the difference. When Winston stood for Parliament, she financed the campaigns. Campaign costs in turn of the century, England were substantial. Agents' fees, printing costs, hall rentals, travel expenses, entertainment for supporters. When Winston needed introductions to powerful men, she hosted the dinners that cost her money she was borrowing against future income. When he needed favorable press, she cultivated the editors at her own expense, hosting lunches and dinners that were designed to produce a paragraph in tomorrow's newspaper. Members of Parliament were not paid until 1911, when the Parliament Act introduced a salary of £400 per year. Until then, political life was a luxury that only wealthy men could afford, or men whose mothers were willing to go bankrupt to sustain the fiction that their sons were wealthy enough to serve. In 1900, Jennie made another investment, this time in herself. She married George Cornwallis West. He was 20 years her junior, roughly the same age as Winston. He was handsome, charming, a captain in the Scots Guards. He was also not particularly wealthy and not particularly driven. The marriage has been interpreted variously as a romantic gamble, a financial calculation, an act of defiance against a society that expected widows of a certain age to retire gracefully from public life, and a simple surrender to loneliness. Winston opposed the match. The Prince of Wales expressed disapproval. Jennie married George anyway. The marriage provided neither financial relief nor lasting happiness. George's business ventures failed. His income was insufficient to cover Jennie's debts, which by this point had been accumulating for decades. Their relationship deteriorated as the gap between Jennie's social world and George's ambitions widened. They divorced in 1913, after which George married the actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell. Jennie was left alone and financially exposed in her late 50s, having spent 13 years in a second marriage that had solved nothing and cost her further reserves of social capital and emotional energy. The paradox of Jennie's financial life is that her recklessness was itself a source of power. A woman who was known to be broke would have been excluded from the circles where power operated. A woman who appeared prosperous, who entertained lavishly, who dressed beautifully, who moved through the world as though money were an afterthought, retained access to every drawing room and dinner table that mattered. The illusion was the instrument. Jennie's willingness to spend herself into ruin was not a character flaw. It was a calculated bet that access to power was worth any price. The bet paid off. Winston entered Parliament. Winston rose through the ranks. Winston became a cabinet minister, first as president of the Board of Trade, then as Home Secretary, then as First Lord of the Admiralty. The machine Jennie had built was functioning. Every dinner she had hosted, every pound she had borrowed, every introduction she had arranged, every journalist she had cultivated was bearing fruit in her son's ascending career. But the cost was etched into every ledger Jennie kept, and into many she tried to avoid keeping. By 1910, her accumulated debts were estimated at tens of thousands of pounds. She had borrowed against her trust income so heavily that her future earnings were already spent before they arrived. She had sold family jewelry. She had liquidated investments. She had lived for nearly 4 decades in the narrow gap between what she could afford and what she needed, and that gap had never closed. It had only widened year by year until the gap was all there was. But the machine's builder was running out of fuel, and the world she had built it in was about to disappear. Chapter 9: The World That Forgot Her Name. King Edward VII died in 1910, and with him died the social universe that had made Jennie Jerome Churchill powerful. Edward's death on May 6, 1910, was more than the passing of a monarch. It was the collapse of an ecosystem. The Marlborough House set, the social world that had sustained Jennie's influence for more than 30 years, had revolved around Edward's personality, his appetites, his tolerance, his delight in witty women and unconventional company. For 3 decades, Edward had been the sun around which Jennie orbited, the gravitational force that kept her in position. His son, George V, was a different kind of king entirely. George was dutiful, he was conservative, he was devoted to his wife, Queen Mary, with a fidelity that his father would have found incomprehensible. He was profoundly uninterested in the kind of glittering, transgressive social world his father had cultivated. The great houses where Edward had conducted his affairs and brokered his friendships were replaced by a court atmosphere of stiff propriety and naval discipline. There was no place in George's England for a woman like Jennie Jerome Churchill. The shift was not dramatic, it was gradual and complete. The great political hostesses of the Edwardian era found their guest lists shrinking. The dinner parties that had once determined cabinet appointments became mere social events with diminishing political significance. The aristocratic world that had been Jennie's operating theater was being replaced by a political culture that ran on party machinery, trade union affiliations, professional civil servants, and a press that was becoming too large, too diverse, and too democratic to be managed by a single hostess's personal relationships. The levers Jennie had mastered were being disconnected from the machinery of power. Jennie was in her late 50s. She was divorced. She was deeper in debt than ever, and the skills she had spent decades perfecting, the ability to charm a room, to curate a guest list that would alter the course of legislation, to broker a political introduction over a dinner table, were becoming obsolete. The world had not abolished her kind of power. It had simply moved on. The First World War accelerated the destruction beyond anything anyone could have predicted. The conflict that began in August 1914 shattered the aristocratic networks Jennie had spent her life constructing. The young men who had attended her dinners were dying in the mud of Flanders and on the beaches of Gallipoli. The country houses where political deals had been struck were being requisitioned as hospitals and military headquarters. The old world of personal connections and whispered negotiations was being swept away by a conflict that demanded industrial organization, mass mobilization, and a scale of suffering that rendered drawing room politics irrelevant. Jennie threw herself into war work. She organized fundraising concerts. She raised money for soldiers' charities. She lent her name to causes that needed the prestige of the Churchill connection. She was useful, but no longer essential. The war had produced its own power structures, and they did not require hostesses. Winston, now First Lord of the Admiralty, was at the center of the war's strategic decisions. The Dardanelles campaign, his audacious attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by forcing the straits at Gallipoli, was conceived with exactly the kind of boldness Jennie had always encouraged in him. It was also a catastrophe. The naval assault failed. The ground invasion that followed produced months of brutal, pointless fighting. Over 40,000 Allied soldiers died. Many more were wounded. Winston was forced to resign from the Admiralty in November 1915. His reputation shattered, and his political future apparently destroyed. Jennie watched this disaster from the margins. She could not fix it. The networks she might once have mobilized to rehabilitate her son's reputation were scattered, diminished, or dead. The levers of power she had once operated with such precision were no longer connected to anything. She was a master craftsman watching her tools become antiques. In 1918, she married for the third time. Montague Porch was a colonial civil servant in the Nigerian political service. He was 41 years old, 3 years younger than Winston. He was 23 years younger than Jennie. The marriage astonished everyone who heard about it. Even Winston, who had tolerated his mother's marriage to Cornwallis West with difficulty, found this third match embarrassing and difficult to explain. But Jennie had never made decisions based on what others found comfortable. She married Porch because she wanted to. It was, in a life defined by strategic calculation, an act of pure personal defiance. The Representation of the People Act, passed in February of that same year, granted limited voting rights to women over the age of 30 who met certain property qualifications. For the first time in her life, Jennie Jerome Churchill was allowed to participate in the political system she had been manipulating for 4 decades. She was 64 years old. She had spent 30 years building political careers, financing campaigns, lobbying prime ministers, and overriding generals. Now, finally, the law acknowledged that she had the right to cast a ballot. The irony was almost too precise to be real. The final years were quiet and diminished. Jennie lived in London. She entertained modestly when she could afford to entertain at all. She watched Winston's career recover slowly from the Gallipoli catastrophe. He served as Minister of Munitions, then Secretary of State for War and Air, then Colonial Secretary. His career was rebuilding, but it was rebuilding slowly, without the dramatic momentum that Jennie's interventions had once provided. On a day in late May of 1921, Jennie was visiting Lady Horner, a friend at Mel's in Somerset. She was wearing new shoes with fashionable high heels. She fell down a staircase. She broke her left ankle. The injury seemed manageable. It was not. Gangrene developed in the damaged tissue. In the days before antibiotics, gangrene was a death sentence unless the infected limb was removed. On June the 10th, surgeons amputated Jennie's left leg above the knee. She appeared to recover. She was conscious. She spoke to visitors. She seemed to be improving. On June the 29th, 1921, the femoral artery in the stump of her left leg hemorrhaged. She bled to death in her London home. She was 67 years old. At the time of Jennie's death, Winston Churchill was Colonial Secretary, managing the aftermath of the First World War in the Middle East. He was a prominent but not dominant figure in British politics. His reputation had been damaged by Gallipoli and only partially restored. He was considered brilliant but unreliable, audacious but reckless. He was 19 years from his appointment as Prime Minister. Jennie Jerome Churchill died believing, if she believed anything about Winston's future, that her investment might still pay off someday. She had worked for 30 years. She had spent a fortune she never had. She had sacrificed a love she never replaced. She had endured decades of debt, loss, and diminishment. She could not have known that it would pay off beyond anything she had ever imagined. She could not have known that it would save the world. Chapter 10. 19 Years Too Early. On May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the woman who made it possible had been dead for 19 years. The gap between Jennie's death and Winston's finest hour is the cruelest dimension of her story. 19 years, nearly 2 decades. The woman who had lobbied prime ministers, overridden generals, financed campaigns, curated guest lists, charmed princes, raised hospital ships, and spent herself into financial ruin to build her son's career, missed the payoff by the length of a generation. When she died in 1921, Winston was a middling cabinet minister with a damaged reputation. When he became prime minister in 1940, it was because every other option had been exhausted. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had failed. France was falling. The British Expeditionary Force was retreating to the beaches of Dunkirk. The country needed a leader who was willing to fight when fighting seemed hopeless, to refuse surrender when surrender seemed rational, to believe that one nation could stand alone against the greatest military machine ever assembled. Winston Churchill was that leader because Jennie Jerome Churchill had built him to be. Consider the elements, his social instincts. Winston moved through the political world with an ease that his contemporaries often lacked. He knew how to work a room. He knew how to make a powerful man feel valued and a rival feel respected. He knew how to build alliances not through party machinery alone, but through personal relationships, through lunches and letters and well-timed compliments. These were Jennie's gifts, transmitted through decades of example and through the world she had created around him, his understanding of how power actually operates. Winston grasped, earlier than most politicians of his generation, that formal authority and real influence were not the same thing. He cultivated journalists with the same care Jennie had shown. He built networks that crossed party lines, just as she had built networks that crossed national boundaries. He understood that the person who controlled the conversation often controlled the outcome, even if someone else held the title. This was Jennie's operating principle, the insight she had lived by for 40 years, now replicated in her son's instincts. His audacity, Winston Churchill's willingness to gamble everything on a single conviction, to stand alone against appeasement throughout the 1930s when his own party considered him a nuisance, to reject negotiation with Hitler when Britain stood without allies in the summer of 1940, this was not merely courage, it was a learned behavior. He had watched his mother bet everything on a single outcome, again and again, without guarantee and without safety net. He had absorbed the lesson that boldness, even reckless boldness, was preferable to cautious surrender. His rhetorical fire, the oratory that rallied a nation, was shaped by many influences, by the classical education of Harrow and Sandhurst, by the journalism he practiced as a young war correspondent, But it was also shaped by Bork Cochran, the American congressman who had been one of Jennie's lovers and who became Winston's speaking mentor. Through Cochran, Jennie connected her son to the American rhetorical tradition, with its emphasis on emotional persuasion, its willingness to reach for the grand phrase, its understanding that a speech is not an argument, but a performance. The voice that held civilization together against fascism was a voice that Jennie Jerome Churchill had helped to create, through a connection that only she could have made. She never heard it at full volume. She died before the speeches that would define the century. She died without knowing that the machine she built would produce the most consequential leader of the modern age. She invested everything and collected nothing. This is the cruelest truth of the dynasty maker's story. The gap between investment and return is not days or months or even years. It is decades. The woman who built the machine did not live to see it fulfill its purpose, and the man who fulfilled it spent the rest of his life being celebrated as though he had built himself. He had not. She had. And she had been dead for 19 years before anyone could know what she had built. Dara Chapter 11. The codes she broke for every woman after her. Jennie Jerome Churchill never campaigned for women's suffrage, and yet she proved something the suffragists could not. The suffragists proved that women deserved the vote. Jennie proved that women could operate power. These are not the same achievement, and neither diminishes the other. The right to participate in democracy is a legal milestone, a recognition of fundamental human equality. The demonstration that a woman could conceive, fund, and execute a political career, that she could override generals and pressure prime ministers and manage press campaigns and build intelligence networks and raise a hospital ship and finance a decade of parliamentary elections, is something else entirely. It is proof of capacity. And proof of capacity, demonstrated through action rather than argument, is harder to deny than any legal claim. Jennie did not think of herself as a pioneer. She was not ideological about the position of women. She did not march for suffrage. She did not write pamphlets about the rights of her sex. She did not chain herself to railings or endure forced feeding in prison, as the suffragettes of the next generation would do. She would have been baffled by the suggestion that she was advancing the cause of women. She was advancing the cause of Winston. She was advancing her own position. Everything she did for specific personal dynastic purposes. But the precedent she set was larger than her purpose. It always is. She was the most prominent of the so-called dollar princesses, the more than 100 American women who married into the British peerage between 1870 and 1914, carrying American fortunes across the Atlantic to shore up decaying English estates. These women brought money and frequently vitality, ambition, and a democratic directness that the British aristocracy found simultaneously useful and unsettling. Consuelo Vanderbilt married the 9th Duke of Marlborough in 1895 in a union arranged by her mother that brought millions to Blenheim Palace. Mary later married Lord Curzon, who became Viceroy of India, but Jennie was the first of the great dollar princesses, and the most consequential. She proved that the model could work. She demonstrated that an American woman, armed with intelligence, beauty, and strategic nerve, could not merely survive in the British aristocracy, but dominate it, reshaping its politics and its future from within. Her rehabilitation by historians has been slow, but steady. For decades after her death, she appeared in history books as a footnote to Winston's story, his glamorous mother, mentioned in passing and then abandoned. Ralph Martin's 2-volume biography, published in 1969 and 1971, was the first serious attempt to tell Jennie's story on her own terms. Anne Seba's biography, first published in 1998, deepened the picture with access to family archives and private letters. Subsequent studies have continued to restore Jennie to the center of the Churchill narrative, recognizing that the story of Winston Churchill cannot be told honestly without telling the story of the woman who built him. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted limited voting rights to women over 30 who met certain property qualifications. Full equal suffrage would not arrive until 1928, 7 years after Jennie's death. She lived long enough to see the legal system begin to acknowledge what she had demonstrated through action for 30 years, that women were not merely capable of participating in public life, but were already doing so, had been doing so, and would continue to do so, whether the law recognized them or not. What Jennie proved was simple and radical. The barriers to female power were not walls, they were codes, systems of rules designed by men, enforced by custom, and maintained by the assumption that women could not learn them. Any woman willing to study those codes with the precision of a diplomat and the nerve of a gambler could break through them. Jennie broke through, and the opening she created has never fully closed. The tools she used, beauty, charm, social intelligence, strategic relationships, were the only tools available to a woman of her era. They were not the tools that history celebrates. History celebrates legislation and elections and battlefield victories, the formal instruments of power wielded by men who had legal access to them. Jennie's tools were informal, personal, and deniable. They left no paper trail of authority. They produced no official record, and yet they moved prime ministers, overrode generals, launched careers, funded wars, and shaped the trajectory of an empire. The informal power she exercised was not lesser power. It was different power, and it was, in many ways, more difficult to wield, precisely because it depended entirely on the operator's skill and nerve, with no institutional structure to fall back on when things went wrong. This is her legacy. Not a law, not an institution, not a foundation bearing her name, something more fundamental and more enduring, the demonstrated proof that the system's barriers were breakable and that breaking them could change the world. Chapter 12. What Power Demands of Women. She was buried at Blaydon Churchyard, near Blenheim Palace, in the same ground where Winston would join her 44 years later. The churchyard is small and quiet. It sits in the Oxfordshire countryside, in the shadow of the palace that Jennie entered as a suspect American bride in 1874. The grave is modest. There is no monument to what she built. There is no plaque explaining that the most consequential political career of the 20th century was engineered from this family's dinner tables and drawing rooms by a woman who could not cast a ballot for most of her life. Visitors to Blaydon come to see Winston's grave. Few pause at Jennie's. The cost of what Jennie Jerome Churchill accomplished must be reckoned honestly because the cost is part of the story. She was an absent mother. Winston's childhood letters remain in archives, small monuments to a boy's unrelenting longing for a mother who was always somewhere else, always doing something she considered more important. She gave him a career. She did not give him a childhood. The trade cannot be called fair. It can only be called deliberate. She chose the investment over the intimacy, the future over the present, the dynasty over the boy. The boy noticed. He carried the wound for the rest of his life, and he never stopped loving her for inflicting it. She was financially ruined. She spent her entire adult life maintaining an illusion of wealth that ate through every pound she possessed, and many she did not. The debts accumulated over decades were never fully resolved. She died in a house she could not properly afford, wearing shoes that cost her life. She lost the love she wanted. Charles Kinski married someone else because Jennie was not the right kind of woman for an Austro-Hungarian aristocratic dynasty. George Cornwallis West divorced her and married an actress. Montague Porch survived her, but could not replace what she had lost. The great romantic passion of her life was sacrificed on the altar of the dynastic project she chose instead. And she died without knowing whether any of it had worked. This is the question at the center of Jennie Jerome Churchill's story. Not whether she held power, she did. Not whether she exercised it effectively. She did that too, with a brilliance that her contemporaries recognized, even when they could not fully articulate what they were seeing. The question is what it means that the most consequential political career of the 20th century was built by a woman who could not vote, could not hold office, and received nothing in return but the hope that her investment might pay off for someone else, in a future she would never inhabit. The formal history of power records prime ministers, presidents, generals, and kings. It records the men who stood at podiums and signed documents and gave orders and received the credit. It does not, as a rule, record the women who positioned those men, who financed their campaigns, who curated their networks, who managed their crises, who lobbied their superiors, who overcame their obstacles, who gave them the nerve to believe they were destined for something extraordinary. Jennie Jerome Churchill operated in that unrecorded space for 30 years. She held no title that granted authority. She held no office that conferred legitimacy. She possessed no legal right that the system could not revoke on a whim. And from that position of formal powerlessness, she built a machine that produced the leader who held Western civilization together when it was closest to collapse. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked into the rooms where the decisions were being made, and she sat down. Every woman who has managed a political campaign from behind a candidate's name. Every mother who has poured her ambitions into a child because the world would not let her pursue them for herself. Every strategist who has shaped an outcome and watched someone else receive the credit. Every woman who has understood that formal power and real power are not the same thing, and that the gap between them is where the actual work of the world gets done. They are all inheritors of what Jennie Jerome Churchill built. She was born in Brooklyn. She died near Blenheim. In between, she constructed the 20th century's most consequential political career with nothing but charm, intelligence, nerve, and a refusal to accept that the rules applied to her. The rules were wrong, she was right, and the world she helped save never knew her name. The next time you hear the voice of Winston Churchill, crackling through archival recordings, promising his nation that they will fight on the beaches and in the fields and in the streets, remember the woman who made that voice possible. Remember the Brooklyn girl who crossed an ocean. Remember the bride who bought her way into an empire. Remember the hostess who turned dinner parties into political weapons. Remember the mother who chose a dynasty over a childhood. Remember the woman who raised a hospital ship from nothing, who overrode a general's refusal, who spent a fortune she never possessed, who loved a man she could not keep, and who died in a stairwell wearing fashionable shoes, 19 years too early to see what she had built. Remember Jennie Jerome. The world owes her that much,